There is a kingdom that no longer appears on any modern map, and yet its DNA is still being carried, quietly, in the blood of millions of people who have never set foot inside its old borders. For centuries, the story of Polish ancestry seemed settled. A Slavic people. A kingdom that rose in the shadow of empires, stretched across the plains between the Baltic and the Carpathians, and passed its blood down through names that still survive today. Kolski, Nowak, Wisniewski, Wojcik, Kamiński, Lewandowski, Zielinski, Szymanski, Wozniak, Dabrowski, Kozlowski, Jankowski, Mazur, Wojciechowski. 14 names. 14 threads, stretching back through partitions, uprisings, and centuries of shifting borders. The assumption was simple: one people, one origin, one long unbroken line reaching back to the early Polish tribes of the Vistula and Warta River basins. But when researchers finally turned genome-wide analysis toward these bloodlines, what they found was not a single royal thread. It was something older, stranger, and far more layered than any coat of arms could explain. This is the story of what the DNA actually found. The conventional history is not wrong, exactly. It is simply incomplete. Historians and linguists have long traced Polish identity to the West Slavic tribes who settled the lands between the Oder and the Bug rivers by the early medieval period. The Polans, the Vistulans, the Masovians, the Silesians, tribal groups whose gradual unification under the Piast dynasty in the 10th century produced the kingdom that would eventually carry the name Poland. That kingdom expanded, contracted, merged with Lithuania, fractured under partition, and reassembled itself again and again across 1,000 turbulent years. Through all of it, the story went: a continuous Slavic bloodline persisted, the same essential population, wearing different political costumes. It is an elegant narrative. It explains the language. It explains the church records, the noble registries, the surnames themselves, many of which were formalized precisely during the Commonwealth era, when tracking lineage mattered for land, title, and taxation. For a long time, it seemed like enough. Except the geography never quite matched the simplicity of the story. Poland sits at one of the most contested crossroads in European history. A flat, open corridor with no mountain wall to the east, no sea to the south, nothing to stop the movement of armies, traders, and entire populations for thousands of years. Balts to the north. Germanic peoples to the west. Rus principalities to the east. Steppe raiders, Mongol, Tatar, later Ottoman-aligned forces, pressing from the southeast for centuries. A kingdom built on open ground does not stay genetically simple. And archaeologists working the borderlands kept finding material culture that did not cleanly separate into Polish and foreign burial customs, metalwork, and settlement patterns that blurred at every frontier, suggesting the tribes that became Poland were absorbing outside populations long before any kingdom existed to record it. That friction sat quietly in the background for a long time. Then genetics arrived with tools historians never had. Mitochondrial DNA preserves the maternal line, passed unchanged from mother to child across generations, allowing researchers to trace ancient female lineages with remarkable stability. The Y chromosome does the same for the paternal line, father to son, largely undisturbed by mixture on the maternal side. And autosomal, whole genome analysis goes further still, comparing broad swaths of inherited DNA across entire populations to detect admixture, migration waves, and shared ancestry that neither lineage alone can reveal. Together, these tools do something no chronicle, no noble registry, no church record could ever do. They read the population itself, rather than the story the population told about itself. When these tools were applied to samples drawn from across historical Polish territory, the picture that emerged was not a single, continuous Slavic population quietly persisting for 1,000 years. It was a layered one. If deep dive stories like this hold your attention, consider subscribing, because almost every population researchers have studied this closely turns out to carry more layers than its official history ever accounted for. The first layer confirmed what was expected. A strong, dominant Slavic genetic signature runs through nearly every sampled Polish lineage, consistent with the early medieval tribal populations historians had long identified as the demographic core of the kingdom. That part of the story held. But it did not hold alone. Beneath and alongside that core signature, researchers began detecting smaller, persistent genetic contributions that did not originate from Slavic populations at all. Traces consistent with Baltic-adjacent ancestry appeared more strongly in northern lineages, near the historical borderlands with Prussia and Lithuania. Unsurprising, given 1,000 years of shared frontier, yet a detail the simple Polish equals Slavic narrative had never fully absorbed. In eastern and southeastern lineages, researchers noted signals consistent with long-term contact and intermarriage with populations from the Rus principalities and, in some cases, with steppe-adjacent groups whose presence in the region predates the kingdom itself by centuries. And running quietly beneath nearly every regional sample was a deeper, older layer, ancestry connected to populations that occupied the North European plain long before any Slavic-speaking group arrived in the form history remembers. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. The story did not collapse under this evidence. It widened. Researchers now weigh several explanations for what this layered picture actually represents, and none of them has been declared final. One possibility is straightforward long-term regional admixture, centuries of intermarriage between Slavic settlers and the Baltic, Germanic, and steppe-adjacent populations who already occupied or bordered the same territory, gradually blending without ever fully erasing the older signals. A second possibility involves a deeper, pre-Slavic substrate, a population or several populations who inhabited the North European plain before the Slavic migrations of the early medieval period, and who were not replaced so much as absorbed, their DNA persisting quietly inside a culture that would eventually call itself something else entirely. A third possibility, increasingly discussed among population geneticists, involves the kingdom itself as an engine of mixture, a medieval and early modern state that, through serfdom, migration, war, and later the vast multi-ethnic reality of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, actively pulled Baltic, Ruthenian, German, and steppe frontier populations into a shared political and eventually genetic orbit, long before modern nationalism ever imagined Polish ancestry as a fixed, singular category. None of these frameworks cancels the others. Researchers increasingly suspect the truth involves all three, layered across different centuries. The most decisive evidence came from broader ancient DNA comparison studies conducted over the past decade and a half, drawing on burial remains recovered from across Central and Eastern Europe and compared against dense modern reference panels spanning the Baltic, the North European plain, and the Western steppe. These larger comparisons mattered more than earlier, smaller studies because they finally allowed researchers to place medieval and early modern Polish populations on a much longer genetic timeline, not simply comparing modern Poles to modern neighbors, but comparing the deep ancestral layers beneath both. And that wider comparison produced the twist researchers had not fully anticipated. The oldest, most persistent genetic layer detected across historical Polish territory did not align most closely with the early Slavic tribal populations the traditional origin story treated as the true starting point. In a meaningful number of ancient and modern samples, the deepest shared ancestry pointed toward earlier populations of the North European plain, communities that had occupied this same corridor of forest and river for thousands of years before the Slavic migrations of the 6th and 7th centuries ever reached it. Not the founding population expected. Not even the era expected. The genome was not overturning the Slavic story. It was revealing something beneath it, an older frontier world that the Slavic-speaking tribes had unknowingly inherited, absorbed, and carried forward without ever knowing its name, the way a river carries silt from ground it no longer touches. This is why the 14 surnames matter, and why they can only tell part of the story. Kolski, Nowak, Wisniewski, and the rest are overwhelmingly Slavic in form and function, many formalized during the Commonwealth era as occupational or descriptive names. Kolski from Kowal, a blacksmith. Nowak marking a newcomer to a village. Wojciech tied to the office of a local administrator. They tell you what a family did, or where it stood, at the moment the name was fixed. What they cannot tell you is the far older, far deeper genetic inheritance sitting quietly behind that name, layers of ancestry from populations who never spoke Polish, never called themselves Slavic, and vanished from written history long before any kingdom needed a surname to tax or conscript its people. And this pattern is not unique to Poland. It is part of something researchers keep rediscovering wherever they look closely enough. Human populations are rarely the clean, linear bloodlines that national histories prefer to tell. Migration is not a single march from point A to point B. It is centuries of contact, absorption, retreat, and remixing, most of it undocumented. Most of it invisible to written history because the people involved never thought to record it, or were never in a position to. Identity, as it turns out, is almost always a layered inheritance rather than a pure one, and the old maps, the ones built on tribes and kingdoms and singular origin points, were simply too small to hold what actually happened to the people living on that ground. Picture the Vistula in early spring, ice breaking apart and drifting past low riverbanks lined with birch and alder, the water carrying silt from forests that have stood, in some form, for 10,000 years. Picture the open plain east of Krakow, flat and pale under winter light, offering no natural wall against anyone who ever wished to cross it, Balt, Russ, Mongol, German, and eventually Slav, each leaving something behind in the ground and in the blood of whoever remained. This was never empty land waiting for a kingdom to arrive and fill it. It was already layered with human history when the first Polish tribes began to unify, and every population that followed inherited more of that older world than any chronicle ever admitted. That may be the deepest truth sitting beneath all 14 surnames, and beneath every family that carries a name like them. A surname preserves the story a family and a kingdom chose to remember, an occupation, a village, a title formalized on paper. The genome preserves the story nobody thought to write down at all. The Polish kingdom was never simply a single Slavic bloodline persisting unbroken from the Piast tribes to the present day. It was, and remains, something closer to a long accumulation, a population built from contact with nearly every group that ever crossed that open plain, absorbing older layers it never fully recognized, and carrying them forward inside names that sound, on the surface, entirely simple. If your family carries one of these 14 names, or 100 others formed the same way across that same landscape, the genome inside you is not just a record of a medieval kingdom. It is a record of everything that kingdom quietly absorbed to become itself, an inheritance older and stranger than any single origin story could ever hold. The map is still incomplete. Researchers continue refining it with every new sample, every new burial site, every new comparison panel. But each discovery adds one more fragment to a picture that keeps growing larger rather than smaller, and somewhere inside that widening picture, a name passed down for centuries is still quietly carrying a history that began long before the kingdom that gave it meaning.